Hello, listeners. Welcome to Inside TechCom with your host, Zahra Mutabana. In Season 3, we shift our focus to shed light on why technical communication is a core business asset. In this regard, we will speak with guests who are our stakeholders, such as product managers, marketing professionals, UX designers, QA, and customer support, who engage with writers to create a seamless experience for the customer and meet business goals together. Let's get started. Our guest today is Matt Rife. Matt is an award-winning design professional with experience spanning a variety of sectors and applications. Matt came to the design world after several years working in IT and uses his unique background to craft exceptional user experiences for the real world. Matt is currently the head of experience design at S3E2 and the founder of 58 Creative, and also runs the Pragmatic XD blog. I'm honored to welcome today's guest, Matt Rife. Hi, Matt. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very good. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's get started. Tell us a little about yourself, Matt.
So I'm a user experience designer, and currently I lead the experience design department at a healthcare software company. And specifically, the products we work on are those used by hospitals and clinics, mostly back office type things. So not a lot of client-facing stuff, but it's very, very complex and very interesting.
All right. I was looking at your website, which is, by the way, really awesome. And
Thank you.
You're welcome. I saw that you had a pretty interesting background. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. And you did mention that you have a background in IT. How did you end up in design? Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Absolutely. So design is my second career. I began my career in IT as a systems administrator. So I started out in data centers doing like servers and mainframe type administration. And I did that for quite a while, wanted to get a little closer to the business. So I actually transitioned into a business analysis role within IT. And then I started doing some freelance writing. And through the writing I was doing, I kind of stumbled into the design world, and it seemed really, really interesting, something really different from what I was doing. And I for a while, kind of been looking at ways to get out of doing IT work. So this was before virtualization, all the stuff we have today. So there was a lot of 2 a.m. data center trips and things like that. So I went ahead and got my degree in graphic design, and the rest, as they say, is history. And it just so happened that once I graduated with my design degree, this was 2010. So smartphones had just come out. The iPhone was about 3 years old. Android was just about a year old at that time. And so it was kind of serendipitous. I had this IT background, a design degree, and there was all this convergence, and user experience was really coming to the forefront at that point. So I just sort of wound up on the path, and here I am today.
Wow, that's one interesting story there. One heck of a story. Now, to me, when somebody says they're from IT, I think of a very techie person. I cannot think of them as a creative person. And that's my limited thinking. So is that the reason why you went to design school? Or was it something that you know innately that you had and you just wanted to learn more about how design would apply to user experience?
I don't necessarily know that it was something innate. It was just something really different from what I was doing. And it seemed interesting and exciting to me. And so I obviously did some research and things before running off and completing a degree in it, but
Right.
It just seemed really interesting. I did the research. I did a little bit of work and talked to people and explored the opportunities in the field, and just at some point decided to go for it.
You also mentioned that you've done writing and then transitioned into a more specific design role. How did writing contribute to your design career?
So this kind of came about, this is another one of those funny stories. So my spouse at the time, she's a very talented writer and editor. And she said, you're actually not a bad writer. You should do something with that. So I'm like, okay, sure. So I knew some folks. I kind of poked around and found some people who were willing to give me some freelance gigs. And I wrote primarily journalistic content. So Austin Woman Magazine, I lived in Austin at the time. So Austin Woman Magazine, Austin Business Journal, a couple of other local publications. So by doing the writing, especially for publications like those, I was exposed to the larger picture of what goes into producing these websites, newspapers, magazines, whatever. So then I kind of got exposed to the photographers, the designers. And I thought, wow, design is one of those things that's everywhere. A lot of times you just don't see it or don't think about it directly. And it was one of those things that when I was kind of exposed to, was like, wow, this is really cool. This is really interesting. And as I said, I kind of started looking into it, talking to people, and thought, yeah, this is what I'm going to go do.
You said that you work as a designer today and you're creating user experience design. So was that the objective eventually, or were you, because I'm trying to put my handle around UX design and designing for media. Are these two different things, or would you say that there is a commonality there?
There is some overlap. And so I went to a very traditional graphic design program. One of the professors I had did a master's degree at Cal, and they do a huge number of book. Like, he was very much into bookbinding. So I learned and can still hand bind a hardbound book.
Oh,
It's something I learned. Yes, I can sew that up and glue it and put together a handbound book. So, but really, when you get into user experience, there is a fair amount of technical involved. So one, of course, is that these things have to be built. So there are printing processes and things like that if you're doing print design. On the technical side, you have to deal with developers, and you have to deal with the frameworks and the technology and the tools available to you. And there are certain limitations. So, for example, if you're designing for a mobile device, you've only got so much screen space.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other things with mobile devices in particular is that, especially on the Android side, there's such a huge variety of devices. It's like, how do I make this work on the tiniest sort of lowest end phone there is versus I've got a brand new Samsung Galaxy 20 or whatever. So there is some overlap in terms of the visuals, thinking about things like typographic hierarchies, color design, things like that. But it sort of goes off in a lot of different ways from there.
Okay. I would have thought so, but I think, thank you for sharing that insight. I always learn something new about it. As you launched yourself into user experience design, would that be the right term? Would that be the right way to coin that?
Yes.
Okay.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
All right. So writing is a very important part of user experience. And since my podcast is about an audience who may be interested in launching their career as into UX writing, I kind of want to dive right into that question with you. What does that look like?
It depends. And if you look at traditional experience design or user experience design, you're looking typically at a lot of microcopy. So if you're looking at mobile apps, let's say something like payments app or a banking app or something like that, you're looking at the microcopy. Like, how can I convey what these people need to do or what information they need to complete their task or whatever they're trying to do in a quick, simple kind of way? Because I hate to tell my copywriters this, but especially on mobile, folks don't read. They don't really read through. They're just like trying to get through as quickly as they can. So you've got to make it clear and concise. That's the most important thing. But when you get into sort of enterprise applications, when we're talking about things like the healthcare stuff that I work on now, or CRM applications, or especially enterprise type stuff, there's a lot more there. So there's still that element of the microcopy user experience, like, hey, I need to explain to someone how to fill out this form or what happens here. So that's an important element of it. Mm-hmm. But then there's a lot more in-depth content that has to be written. So you think about traditional help content, or I spent a lot of time, I've worked in financial services for about 10 years. So when you get into highly regulated industries like banking and healthcare, there's a lot of content that goes along with that, regulatory content. I worked on some credit card servicing applications, and our FAQ sections for that were just enormous. And so getting that information there, making it clear, making it accessible was a little more long form, obviously.
Okay.
But you've got to be clear, especially when you're dealing with things like healthcare and banking, because most folks just don't really understand the intricacies of it. So making it accessible.
Making it accessible. I think what I'm realizing is, as we are talking about what does UX writing look like, technical writing is generally long form, traditionally speaking. And my takeaway from this conversation is that a UX writer, let's just call it a writer who wants to get into UX writing has to start thinking of the medium even more and the microcopy, right? In your experience, have you worked with technical writers that went on to become UX writers?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I have a friend of mine who actually started out as sort of a traditional content strategist, ended up doing some technical writing, and then over time transitioned into doing more UX writing. So the shorter form, sort of micro copy work that she does today.
I see. Did that require this friend of yours to kind of revisit the way they wrote copy?
Yeah, for sure. You've really got to be, instead of having 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs or more, you've really got to get the point across in maybe a sentence, 2 if you're lucky. So you've got to be punchy and concise and just like, bang, there it is. And that's kind of all you get.
I see. I haven't interviewed a UX writer per se. So you are kind of my segue into that. When a UX writer works with you on a design team, what are you looking for besides, somebody that can write and that somebody that can write micro copy? What does that partnership and collaboration look like?
So as with anyone on the team, especially in design, especially in user experience design, you need to understand the audience and you need to have empathy for the people you're writing for. So user experience research is very important to kind of laying the groundwork for that. And having someone who can look at that research and understand, oh, okay, I kind of understand the demographics. I understand who's using this. How am I able to get this point across in a way that's accessible to them specifically? So that's really, really important. And I also look for people who can not only have the empathy for the end user, but also understand kind of the bigger picture. So it's applications, and especially, again, enterprise applications can get really complex. So it's someone who can look at that and say, okay, how does this fit into the larger picture of this entire application? So it's really important for them to be able to do that as well. Not just focus on, I'm writing this piece of copy right here, but how does this tie into everything else we're doing within this application?
Okay. I would agree that you got to have that larger picture in mind. That is, even when I'm doing my writing, I have to keep that larger picture in mind, but then I definitely have more real estate to convey that and to write about it. So is there a different mindset as a technical writer moves from enterprise copy over to the UX side? In your opinion, have you had challenges with writers in the capacity that you are? And I want to kind of bring those challenges to the fore, because anybody that's listening, if they're struggling with it, what can they do to overcome? That is my objective in asking this question.
I think one of the real challenges is making it short. So again, if you're used to writing paragraphs or pages and you've got 1 or 2 sentences, really being able to convey that point. I think that's one of the main challenges. And I think people in general, not just writers are I think are certainly more disciplined at this than lay people, but people tend to add things that they tend to write a little longer. So it's like, you really need to edit. It's like, cut it down. I think that's probably the most important thing, the most common thing that's going to face writers who are transitioning from a long form to a shorter form.
I see. Writing. But eventually they do get there.
Oh, sure.
Okay. So yeah, because I think UX writing is something that I have explored, and I have not had the good fortune to kind of make it into. And everywhere that I have worked, they've had dedicated UX teams, but not UX writers per se. It is the designers themselves who do the writing.
That's a challenge. And I face that as well in terms of being able to get staff who are dedicated writers. I've been fortunate because in the past, I've worked on teams where I had dedicated UX writers, copywriters, content people who were able to do that work. And again, especially on large applications, it's vitally important to do that. I'm a fairly competent writer. So yeah, I can write up a little copy and I can do error messages that are, no offense to anyone, but more intelligible than what most developers will write. But it's not my main focus. And so having someone who's dedicated to doing that, who really understands the craft of writing and is able to, again, understand, empathize with the end user from that perspective is just so incredibly useful. And I think that's, as an industry, that's something we continue to struggle with and we need to keep working toward improving.
I want to say thank you for sharing this insight, because I think there are writers out there who are trying to make a business case for adding them to the UX team. And to what you said, that empathizing with the end user and the skill set that they've already been writing for the end user, and they've already developed that empathy, hopefully.
Yeah.
Right. So bringing that, I don't want to say resource, but bringing that experience onto the UX team is definitely going to position the team to achieve that business goal even better.
Absolutely. It absolutely will. And one of the areas where I think you'll see this, and consistency in your messaging is really, really important. And so again, that's where we get back into that big picture view and someone who's skilled at the craft of writing. So even if you're writing long form, you're used to writing in a certain voice that meets the company voice or the product or whatever. And so being able to apply that consistently across a product or, in my case, a series of products is absolutely critical to that being successful. And one of the things about design in general and UX specifically is the devil is indeed in the details. And so little tiny things will make the difference between a really great experience and something that's kind of like, it's all right, it gets the job done. And I think good writing is key to that.
Yes. I think all this while we've been talking about writing, and I know you are an awesome designer, and I've seen some of your portfolio samples on your website. And I want to kind of dive into that as well, because design and writing complement each other. And as a writer, I definitely, when I look at a UX design, I'm like, wow, I don't need to write anything. The design does what it's supposed to do. So I want you to share a little bit about design from a user experience perspective and how, if you didn't have writers, what were some of the challenges? And did having a writer benefit you?
So you're right. A lot of times there is little to no copy, and especially on mobile applications. And it kind of depends. Like if you look at a Maps application, there's not a lot of copy because it's a map, right? Where things can get tricky is messaging, error messaging in particular. So if something goes wrong, you need something that kind of explains what to do and how to fix it, not just like an unknown error occurred, 0x1234F. It's like, well, that doesn't really help me. So being able to do that is really, really important. And when you get into things, especially with banking apps, let's say you're doing a mortgage application or a credit card application or something like that, you get into certain fields and that text field, it may just be a text field, but there may be some help text that goes along with that. Like give me a key as to what I should be putting in here. Like TurboTax or something like that, especially because tax law is nuts, right? So
yeah.
And so even if that isn't always necessarily visible, those little cues and those little bits are absolutely critical to getting that experience right and providing the keys to helping the person trying to complete whatever task that is, help them do it in a nice, seamless, smooth way. And they oh, okay, I know what that is. I can fill this field out and just keep on going. So again, like I said, kind of back at the beginning, really good design is sort of invisible. I think really good writing sometimes, especially in the experience design realm, is kind of the same way. It's like you don't think about it. It's just sort of there. You don't really see it, but it's just critical to making that experience really, really good.
Yeah, I think the key word that really resonates with me is experience, right? You're trying to create this seamless experience. So be it writing or design, at the end of the day, you're trying to communicate something to the end user and make sure that they've met that objective.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's an interesting, you kind of validate what I've been having in the back of my mind. I kind of want to take a little step back here and understand on a typical day, what does that interaction between a UX writer and a designer look like?
So there has to be a lot of really close collaboration. And that probably sounds a little bit cliche, right? Because of course you have to collaborate.
Right.
But there does have to be the shared empathy, which we've already touched upon. And you really have to work together, I guess, almost in lockstep to understand, well, the designer is doing this and the writer is doing this. Like those things have to align because you could have great copy that's nothing to do with what you're trying to do on the screen, or you could make a design that doesn't really fit, especially in regulatory environments where you've got disclosures and things like that. You've got to make sure that stuff lines up, and you've got to make sure that, for example, hey, I've got only so much space available on this screen, or this disclosure needs to be visible here. So there's a lot of little details like that. And sometimes you don't have a lot of control over them. Regulatory is a good example, especially in banking. So you really, really have to be very closely in touch and see how things plug in together. And a lot of times that involves whiteboarding or, hey, here's the copy, drop it into your design and let me take a look at it and things like that to make sure that it fits. So beyond just a cliche collaboration, you really have to be kind of in lockstep together.
In lockstep.
Make sure it locks up. Yeah.
Got it. You and the writer are working in lockstep. Do you involve the writer right from the time you envision what the UI is going to be like? So to me, the terminology would be right from the wireframing stage, or is there a stage before that? Can you share a little bit about that?
As early as possible. So you certainly want them involved at the wireframing stage. If you can, before that as possible as well. And it kind of gets to, if nothing else, you're talking through the concept and kind of what you're doing, what you're working toward. And it gets back to, well, if we have research, which you don't always have research, but if you've got research or whatever, it's like understanding what are we trying to do? How are we going to go about it? And then you start your wireframing, you start your writing. And I think it just is important to kind of get that relationship built even before you start drawing boxes on a screen.
The word that I love, research. You said that sometimes you may not have that. And in that scenario, I see so much of opportunity for designers and writers to work together because you are working with personas in your mind, right? Mm-hmm. You're doing your audience analysis and you're making some assumptions. And all that has to kind of blend together with what the writer is going to write and what the designer is designing.
Right. Research is another challenge. In that regard, it's kind of like writing. So it's so critically important to the process and to producing good products. But a lot of companies just don't do it. It's everything has to be done right away, or we don't want to spend the money or whatever. So some companies do a really good job of that. USAA, for example, does a lot of really great research. And in fact, the company I'm with now is committed to doing research. And although we don't have a dedicated research team, mm-hmm. They certainly encourage and we put aside the time to sit with our end users, talk with them. Even if you're just sitting with them for a couple of hours and seeing what they do, that's incredibly important because you'll see things, even if they don't necessarily pick up on it, you'll see things when you hear them say things. It's like, okay, that sounds like they have a problem there. I need to explore that some more. Oh, that works really well. And so it's really, really important to do that. Even if it's kind of informal, anything helps. And not having research is difficult.
Are you doing the research yourself?
A lot of times, yes. I would like to bring on a full-time researcher at some point, but now it's I do a lot of the research myself. And also, the product managers I work with do a pretty good job of taking notes in their client interactions. So they provide notes. And also, we have a client portal where folks can put in trouble tickets or change requests or feature requests or all that kind of information. So even picking up on that can be really, really important. It's like, oh, they're asking for this feature. Why are they asking for that? And sometimes you want to go back and follow up and say, well, what's your thinking here? Why do you want to do that? And sometimes folks are asking for something and they're really trying to achieve something else. So spending some time and digging into that is very helpful to make sure you get the right solution and not just do, they asked for this thing, we did this thing, but they really wanted this other thing.
Right.
Yeah, the understanding is very, very important.
It's incredible that you get this opportunity to interact with your end user in whatever capacity that might be. And I'm thinking as a writer, how much that would benefit me. And I think as a designer as well, I'm trying to kind of understand how much more important that would be as you start thinking about your end user and how you're going to design a feature or whatever that is you're designing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you a good example. One of the products that I am responsible for has to deal with managing medical claims. If you work at a hospital, they have thousands or tens of thousands of claims that they have to process, a huge amounts of data. And so, it's easy for me as just a designer to say, I'm just going to stick a data table in here and put a bunch of stuff in it. And it's going to be great. Mm-hmm. And then you start talking to people and you find that, well, what they really need to do is open these up and look at them side by side to maybe compare two different claims, or maybe they need to apply the same change to 5 claims at a time. So it's like, okay, well, yeah, I could have just stuck it in a data table and it's fine because they can see it, but it doesn't really solve what they're trying to do. And so again, that insight, like, what are you really doing with this? Oh, you need to put it side by side. So that tells me that I need to make that screen responsive so that you can shrink it down. So you've got 2 on your screen. And again, it kind of goes with understanding what folks are using in terms of hardware. Like, I've got a nice 27-inch big screen monitor on my desk. Hospitals don't buy 27-inch big screen monitors for their staff, right? So I need to understand, okay, what are you really using? What kind of monitor do you have? What does that look like? And what do I need to do to make sure that it works effectively, not just for what you're trying to do, but on the tools you have to work with it on?
As you were, sharing all this invaluable information that you can get from these different sources, that's exactly what I think as a writer too. Where can I get? So I'm thinking if a writer does not have this information, they could go to the designer because the designer will definitely have more information about what kind of technology the end user might end up using or what their environment is going to be like. So that collaboration again and being in lockstep becomes so much more important.
It certainly does. And that's why, to your point, starting as soon as possible, even before wireframing, like, hey, what are we trying to do here? What are the constraints we have to work within? It's really important to have that going in because it's easier to get it right the first time than, and not to say you don't edit or make changes, but get it as close to right the first time as come back and say, oh, well, we spent 3 months designing this and it's totally wrong. So we have to go back and fix it.
Yeah, I think I definitely would agree with that because that actually, this is a good segue into my next question is, you said you want to try and get it right or as close to being right the first time. And we all understand why that is important because at the end of the day, we are trying to enable the user to get to where they need to get to quickly. So the question really is, do you happen to work in an agile environment?
Yes. In fact, I think I've worked in agile environments. I know I started working in agile environments in about 2008, and it's been quite a long time since I've done anything that's not agile.
Going back to the discussion that we just had, where you want to try and get it right without too many iterations. But agile also enables you to be iterative and to make changes and to respond faster. Mm-hmm. In this environment, what does that relationship look like with a writer at that point?
I think the trick with agile is making sure that you get the foundation right to start. Mm-hmm. So you've got to get that part right. And then you're right, through the iterations, you can make additions or make changes. But if you really get it wrong from the start, if you start down the wrong path and you get 6 iterations in, you realize, oh no, this is totally wrong. We have to go back to the start. That's a big problem. So again, just kind of understanding where you're trying to go, what the challenges are, what the constraints are, and then putting that, just taking a little bit of time. I'm not talking like this has to take weeks, but just take a little bit of time to understand what you've got, where you're trying to go, really helps lay the groundwork and lets both the writer and the designer sort of say, okay, here's the framework we're going to use. Here's how we're going to do this, and then actually start executing. And you're right, through the iterations, you can refine that, you can make changes, you can add on to it.
Right.
But that early collaboration is super important to just getting that initial groundwork right.
Yeah, so I think what you're really trying to remind the audience and sort of reinforces that collaboration as soon as you can start for both the designer and hopefully a researcher and a writer to start that journey from the point of conception onwards would rein in much more benefits than kind of bringing on a writer much later in that journey.
If you can even get the writer to sit in on the research sessions, again, there's nothing like firsthand knowledge.
I've had so many questions going through my mind, and I think I've tried to kind of bring a good perspective on what a designer does and how a writer can complement the designer's journey, how the designer can complement a writer's journey in meeting the objective. Matt, is there anything that you would like to add to, if I may have missed anything here?
I think we've pretty well covered it. I think the thing with folks, especially if you're trying to transition from, sort of a longer form or another field into tech writing in general, or, specifically UX writing, is don't necessarily specialize really quickly, like take a more of a generalist approach and see what you can find. And the other thing I'll tell people is that it's really, really important to just look around you, because there are lots, like design and experiences are everywhere. And I'll just give you a good sort of random example, but in the UX world, we have what's called dark patterns. And dark patterns are sort of these tricks that people use to get you to do something maybe you don't want to do. Like if you're in a checkout cart and it's like, you see the little checkbox under, sign up for our newsletter and get free coupons or whatever. Well, really, like people may not want to do that, but how many times do you see that tick box is checked? That's sort of a mild version of that. But I'll tell you, one time I was at a gas pump. So I'm getting gas, putting gas in my car. And I looked at the gas pump and something wasn't right. It confused me for a minute. And I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. And then it hit me. If you normally look at a gas pump, the ratings are 87, 89, 91. This one was the other way around.
Oh.
And so it's like, how many people get out, hit the first button, and in this case are buying the most expensive gas and putting it in their car? So it's things like that that just like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like I'm looking at my phone app or I'm looking at something that's like, this stuff is everywhere. And there's so much stuff you can learn and pick up on. Just really look for it. And don't just look for the, oh, like, it's really cool, but things like that, like, well, that's kind of weird, or that's kind of bad. Like, I don't like that. And that informs the work you do. You can say, oh, well, I had this experience. It was kind of weird. So I know I don't want to do that in my design or in my writing.
No, that is such an amazing advice. You got my attention right when you said, take that generalist approach and don't try to take shortcuts and dive into something too quickly. That is so important because as a writer, I'm trying to apply this advice to myself. I would have loved to be a UX writer because there is this, I don't know, is this a myth or is this a fact? But when I look at the job boards, it appears that UX writers definitely are on a different pay scale than what technical writers are, especially experienced technical writers. So anybody that has been doing technical writing for a long time should not be dismissive and say, oh, I cannot be a UX writer. In fact, they should use that experience to inform where they can take and steer their career towards UX writing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So with the generalist advice that you gave, I'm actually motivated to use that, to employ that advice and say, you know what, whatever I've done so far is not a waste. It's actually going to inform if I transition into a career as a UX writer. So that was invaluable advice.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And one thing to keep in mind is that when we talk a lot about short form on-screen blurbs and things like that, there are lots of examples, again, in some of the larger, more enterprise applications, there are opportunities for some longer form writing that goes along with UX. So just because like, well, this is what I do, this is what I've always done, it doesn't mean that there's not opportunities to transition or even opportunities to kind of, as I said, take a generalist approach. Like, yes, I can write short, one sentence blurbs that explain how something works, or I can write longer form stuff. And I think, again, I talked about having copywriters and content strategists. If I can find someone who can do both and be pretty good at them, I will take those people anytime, because having someone who has more skills is always, always good.
So I think since you introduced these new actors, content strategists and copywriters, how are they different from a technical writer / UX writer? Can you share a little bit about that?
When I talk about copywriters, I typically am talking about more of a traditional marketing copywriter. So folks who write ad copy or social media copy, things like that, which in many ways is still short form copy. Content strategy is a whole other realm around information structure, information organization. And to be honest with you, some of the best experienced designers and content strategists I've worked with are not writers and they're not designers. I can tell you two of the people who are just absolutely stars in this field graduated from the University of Texas Information School. They have master's degrees in library science. And it's like, really? But that's another thing. As a writer, you understand content structure. You understand how things flow, how things piece together, how to get the order right to make things clear. And so even if you don't say, well, I am a content strategist, it's like you have a sort of an innate understanding through the work that you do of how to organize things and get things together so they flow properly. And even if you're talking about micro copy, it's important to get that order right. And also, and that's where that collaboration with the designer, like, hey, I really think that maybe this menu should be this order, or structured this way, or, you're putting these data fields on the screen, like maybe we need to restructure them or reorder them this other way because these things are grouped together. That's a lot of value that someone who it's like, well, I'm just a tech writer, I'm just a UX writer. It's like, no. There's a lot of stuff you have there that you may not necessarily be conscious of. There's a lot of value you can bring into discussions like that are going to be, again, you're going to make those little differences between a good experience and a great experience.
That's wow. That's so true. That is so true. And this is something that we as writers do on a daily basis. It's just that we don't think about it. But what you're trying to do is shine a light on that skill that you may have internalized and to kind of bring that to the fore.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, Matt, this has been such an awesome conversation. Although, you are a UX designer, you have been on my show to really help writers to kind of partner with you and to help writers. So I really appreciate your insight to anybody that is considering moving into this field. But I definitely want to do justice to you as a designer. Is there anything that I can do on my show to help designers through my podcast?
I think shows like this are really, really important. So you're showing kind of the broader view of that. So I think it's easy to get sort of siloed into, well, we're tech writers or we're UX writers and kind of focus on one aspect. And in fact, it's quite broad. So not only the UX designers, but also there's a little bit of a differentiation between like the visual or UI designers. Like that's a whole other kind of thing. And so research is another one where that's crucially important. But I think just highlighting that, hey, we're not necessarily just in this one little box. There's like this whole world and all these other interactions and ultimately other opportunities to branch out and go look for these if you're so inclined. So I just think, keep looking for sort of those opportunities where different, I guess, disciplines cross over.
That's so true. Again, thank you so much for your time, Matt. I always ask this last question. Is there anything at all that you would like to add?
Again, I think the most important thing for folks is to not just focus on what you know or what you've done. Certainly apply that because everything you've done, you can take with you. But I think the fact is, to your point about internalizing things, people know a lot more than they think they know many times. And it's back to our discussion about content. It's like, well, I'm just a writer or whatever. It's like, right, but you organize stuff. There's all this other stuff you do that go along with that. Don't sell yourself short, I think, is one of the key points I would make in closing.
I couldn't agree more with you. Don't sell yourself short. That is so very important. And we all straddle many roles. And this conversation has helped me to kind of not only understand and kind of feel the value that I bring to design, but to see how designers bring value to my field, especially from the research perspective. So that partnership and that collaboration is so very important, and making a business case for that earliest collaboration that you can in your journey is, I think it's tremendously important. And I really appreciate this conversation with you, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. And I hope you have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Absolutely. My pleasure too, Matt. Thank you.
Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app, such as Apple, Google, or Spotify. For the latest on my show, follow me on LinkedIn, Instagram, or visit us at www.insidetechcom.show. Catch you on another episode.